1. The cultural logic of late capitalism. The last few years have been marked by an inverted millenarianism, in which premonitions of the future, catastrophic or redemptive, have been replaced by senses of the end of this or that, the end of ideology, art, or social class, the crisis of Leninism, social democracy, or the welfare state, etc., etc. Taken together, all of these perhaps constitute what is increasingly called postmodernism. The case for its existence depends on the hypothesis of some radical break or coupure, generally traced back to the end of the 1950s or the early 1960s. As the word itself suggests, this break is most often related to notions of the waning or extinction of the 100-year-old modern movement, or to its ideological or aesthetic repudiation. Thus, abstract expressionism in painting, existentialism in philosophy, the final forms of representation in the novel, the films of the great auteurs, or the modernist school of poetry, as institutionalized and canonized in the works of Wallace Stevens, all are now seen as the final extraordinary flowering of a high modernist impulse which is spent and exhausted with them. The enumeration of what follows, then, at once becomes empirical, chaotic, and heterogeneous. Andy Warhol and pop art, but also photorealism, and beyond it, the New Expressionism. The moment in music of John Cage, but also the synthesis of classical and popular styles found in composers like Phil Glass and Terry Riley, and also punk and new wave rock, the Beatles and the Stones, now standing as the high modernist moment of that more recent and rapidly evolving tradition. In film, Godard, post-Godard, and experimental cinema and video, but also a whole new type of commercial film, about which more below. Burroughs, Pynchon, or Ismael Reed on the one hand, and the French Nouveau Roman and its succession on the other, along with alarming new kinds of literary criticism based on some new aesthetic of textuality or écriture. The list might be extended indefinitely, but does it imply any more fundamental change or break than the periodic style and fashion changes determined by an older, high modernist imperative of stylistic innovation? It is in the realm of architecture, however, that modifications in aesthetic production are most dramatically visible, and that their theoretical problems have been most centrally raised and articulated. It was indeed from architectural debates that my own conception of postmodernism, as it will be outlined in the following pages, initially began to emerge. More decisively than in the other arts or media, postmodernist positions in architecture have been inseparable from an implacable critique of architectural high modernism and of Frank Lloyd Wright, or the so-called international style, Le Corbusier, Mies, etc., where formal criticism and analysis of the high modernist transformation of the building into a virtual sculpture, or monumental duck, as Robert Venturi puts it, are at one with reconsiderations on the level of urbanism and of the aesthetic institution. High modernism is thus credited with the destruction of the fabric of the traditional city and its older neighborhood culture by way of the radical disjunction of the new utopian high modernist building from its surrounding context, while the prophetic elitism and authoritarianism of the modern movement are remorselessly identified in the imperious gesture of the charismatic master. Postmodernism in architecture will then logically enough stage itself as a kind of aesthetic populism, as the very title of Venturi's influential manifesto, Learning from Las Vegas, suggests. However, we may ultimately wish to evaluate this populist rhetoric. It has at least the merit of drawing our attention to one fundamental feature of all the postmodernisms enumerated above, namely the effacement in them of the older, essentially high modernist frontier between high culture and so-called mass or commercial culture, and the emergence of new kinds of texts infused with the forms, categories, and contents of that very culture industry so passionately denounced by all the ideologues of the modern, from Leavis and the American New Criticism all the way to Adorno and the Frankfurt School. The postmodernisms have, in fact, been fascinated precisely by this whole degraded landscape of schlock and kitsch, of TV series and Reader's Digest culture, of advertising in motels, of The Late Show and the Grade B Hollywood film, of so-called para-literature, with its airport paperback categories of the Gothic and the romance, the popular biography, the murder mystery, and the science fiction or fantasy novel, materials they no longer simply quote, as a Joyce or a Mahler might have done, but incorporate into their very substance. Nor should the break in question be thought of as a purely cultural affair. Indeed, theories of the postmodern, whether celebratory or couched in the language of moral revulsion and denunciation, bear a strong family resemblance to all those more ambitious sociological generalizations which, at much the same time, bring us the news of the arrival and inauguration of a whole new type of society, most famously baptized post-industrial society, Daniel Bell, but often also designated consumer society, media society, information society, electronic society, or high-tech, and the like. Such theories have the obvious ideological mission of demonstrating, to their own relief, that the new social formation in question no longer obeys the laws of classical capitalism, namely, the primacy of industrial production and the omnipresence of class struggle. The Marxist tradition has therefore resisted them with vehemence, with the signal exception of the economist Ernest Mandel, whose book Late Capitalism sets out not merely to anatomize the historic originality of this new society, which he sees as a third stage or moment in the evolution of capital, but also to demonstrate that it is, if anything, a purer stage of capitalism than any of the moments that preceded it. I will return to this argument later. Suffice it for the moment to anticipate a point that will be argued in Chapter 2, namely, that every position on postmodernism in culture, whether apologia or stigmatization, is also, at one and the same time, and necessarily, an implicitly or explicitly political stance on the nature of multinational capitalism today. A last preliminary word on method. What follows is not to be read as stylistic description, as the account of one cultural style or movement among others. I have rather meant to offer a periodizing hypothesis, and that at a moment in which the very conception of historical periodization has come to seem most problematical indeed. I have argued elsewhere that all isolated or discrete cultural analysis always involves a buried or repressed theory of historical periodization. In any case, the conception of the genealogy largely lays to rest traditional theoretical worries about so-called linear history, theories of stages, and teleological historiography. In the present context, however, lengthier theoretical discussion of such very real issues can perhaps be replaced by a few substantive remarks. One of the concerns frequently aroused by periodizing hypotheses is that these tend to obliterate difference and to project an idea of the historical period as massive homogeneity, bounded on either side by inexplicable chronological metamorphoses and punctuation marks. This is, however, precisely why it seems to me essential to grasp postmodernism not as a style, but rather as a cultural dominant, a conception which allows for the presence and coexistence of a range of very different, yet subordinate features. Consider, for example, the powerful alternative position that postmodernism is itself little more than one more stage of modernism proper, if not indeed of the even older Romanticism. It may indeed be conceded that all the features of postmodernism I am about to enumerate can be detected full-blown in this or that preceding modernism, including such astonishing genealogical precursors as Gertrude Stein, Raymond Roussel, or Marcel Duchamp, who may be considered outright postmodernists, avant la lettre. What has not been taken into account by this view, however, is the social position of the older modernism, or better still, its passionate repudiation by an older Victorian and post-Victorian bourgeoisie, for whom its forms and ethos are received as being variously ugly, dissonant, obscure, scandalous, immoral, subversive, and generally antisocial. It will be argued here, however, that a mutation in the sphere of culture has rendered such attitudes archaic. Not only are Picasso and Joyce no longer ugly, they now strike us on the whole as rather realistic, and this is the result of a canonization and academic institutionalization of the modern movement generally that can be traced to the late 1950s. This is surely one of the most plausible explanations for the emergence of postmodernism itself, since the younger generation of the 1960s will now confront the formerly oppositional modern movement as a set of dead classics, which weigh like a nightmare on the brains of the living, as Marx once said in a different context. As for the postmodern revolt against all that, however, it must equally be stressed that its own offensive features, from obscurity and sexually explicit material to psychological squalor and overt expressions of social and political defiance, which transcend anything that might have been imagined at the most extreme moments of high modernism, no longer scandalize anyone, and are not only received with the greatest complacency, but have themselves become institutionalized, and are at one with the official or public culture of Western society. What has happened is that aesthetic production today has become integrated into commodity production generally. The frantic economic urgency of producing fresh waves of ever more novel-seeming goods, from clothing to airplanes, at ever greater rates of turnover, now assigns an increasingly essential structural function and position to aesthetic innovation and experimentation. Such economic necessities then find recognition in the varied kinds of institutional support available for the newer art, from foundations and grants to museums and other forms of patronage. Of all the arts, architecture is the closest constitutively to the economic, with which, in the form of commissions and land values, it has a virtually unmediated relationship. It will therefore not be surprising to find the extraordinary flowering of the new postmodern architecture grounded in the patronage of multinational business, whose expansion and development is strictly contemporaneous with it. Later, I will suggest that these two new phenomena have an even deeper dialectical interrelationship than the simple one-to-one financing of this or that individual project. Yet this is the point at which I must remind the reader of the obvious, namely, that this whole global, yet American, postmodern culture is the internal and superstructural expression of a whole new wave of American military and economic domination throughout the world. In this sense, as throughout class history, the underside of culture is blood, torture, death, and terror. The first point to be made about the conception of periodization and dominance, therefore, is that even if all the constitutive features of postmodernism were identical with and coterminous to those of an older modernism, a position I feel to be demonstrably erroneous, but which only an even lengthier analysis of modernism proper could dispel, the two phenomena would still remain utterly distinct in their meaning and social function, owing to the very different positioning of postmodernism in the economic system of late capital, and beyond that, to the transformation of the very sphere of culture in contemporary society. This point will be further discussed at the conclusion of this book. I must now briefly address a different kind of objection to periodization, a concern about its possible obliteration of heterogeneity, one most often expressed by the left. And it is certain that there is a strange quasi-Sartrean irony, a winner-loses logic, which tends to surround any effort to describe a system, a totalizing dynamic, as these are detected in the movement of contemporary society. What happens is that the more powerful the vision of some increasingly total system or logic, the Foucault of the Prisons book is the obvious example, the more powerless the reader comes to feel. Insofar as the theorist wins, therefore, by constructing an increasingly closed and terrifying machine, to that very degree he loses, since the critical capacity of his work is thereby paralyzed, and the impulses of negation and revolt, not to speak of those of social transformation, are increasingly perceived as vain and trivial in the face of the model itself. I have felt, however, that it was only in the light of some conception of a dominant cultural logic or hegemonic norm that genuine difference could be measured and assessed. I am very far from feeling that all cultural production today is postmodern, in the broad sense I will be conferring on this term. The postmodern is, however, the force field in which very different kinds of cultural impulses, what Raymond Williams has usefully termed residual and emergent forms of cultural production, must make their way. If we do not achieve some general sense of a cultural dominant, then we fall back into a view of present history as sheer heterogeneity, random difference, a coexistence of a host of distinct forces whose effectivity is undecidable. At any rate, this has been the political spirit in which the following analysis was devised. to project some conception of a new systematic cultural norm and its reproduction in order to reflect more adequately on the most effective forms of any radical cultural politics today. The exposition will take up, in turn, the following constitutive features of the postmodern. A new depthlessness, which finds its prolongation both in contemporary theory and in a whole new culture of the image or the simulacrum. A consequent weakening of historicity, both in our relationship to public history and in the new forms of our private temporality, whose schizophrenic structure, following Lacan, will determine new types of syntax or syntagmatic relationships in the more temporal arts. A whole new type of emotional ground tone, what I will call intensities, which can best be grasped by a return to older theories of the sublime. The deep constitutive relationships of all this to a whole new technology, which is itself a figure for a whole new economic world system. And, after a brief account of postmodernist mutations in the lived experience of built space itself, some reflections on the mission of political arts in the bewildering new world space of late or multinational capital. 1. We will begin with one of the canonical works of high modernism in visual art, Van Gogh's well-known painting of the peasant shoes, an example which, as you can imagine, has not been innocently or randomly chosen. I want to propose two ways of reading this painting, both of which in some fashion reconstruct the reception of the work in a two-stage or double-level process. I first want to suggest that if this copiously reproduced image is not to sink to the level of sheer decoration, it requires us to reconstruct some initial situation out of which the finished work emerges. Unless that situation, which has vanished into the past, is somehow mentally restored, the painting will remain an inert object, a reified end product impossible to grasp as a symbolic act in its own right, as praxis, and as production. This last term suggests that one way of reconstructing the initial situation to which the work is somehow a response is by stressing the raw materials, the initial content, which it confronts and reworks, transforms and appropriates. In Van Gogh, that content, those initial raw materials are, I will suggest, to be grasped simply as the whole object world of agricultural misery, of stark rural poverty, and the whole rudimentary human world of back-breaking peasant toil, a world reduced to its most brutal and menaced, primitive and marginalized state. Fruit trees in this world are ancient and exhausted sticks coming out of poor soil. The people of the village are worn down to their skulls, caricatures of some ultimate grotesque typology of basic human feature types. How is it then that in Van Gogh such things as apple trees explode into a hallucinatory surface of color, while his village stereotypes are suddenly and garishly overlaid with hues of red and green? I will briefly suggest, in this first interpretive option, that the willed and violent transformation of a drab peasant object world into the most glorious materialization of pure color and oil paint is to be seen as a utopian gesture, an act of compensation, which ends up producing a whole new utopian realm of the senses, or at least of that supreme sense, sight, the visual, the eye, which it now reconstitutes for us as a semi-autonomous space in its own right, a part of some new division of labor in the body of capital, some new fragmentation of the emergent sensorium, which replicates the specializations and divisions of capitalist life at the same time that it seeks, in precisely such fragmentation, a desperate utopian compensation for them. There is, to be sure, a second reading of Van Gogh which can hardly be ignored when we gaze at this particular painting, and that is Heidegger's central analysis in Der Ursprung des Kunstwerks, which is organized around the idea that the work of art emerges within the gap between earth and world, or what I would prefer to translate as the meaningless materiality of the body and nature, and the meaning endowment of history and the social. We will return to that particular gap or rift later on. Suffice it here to recall some of the famous phrases that model the process, whereby these henceforth illustrious peasant shoes slowly recreate about themselves the whole missing object world which was once their lived context. In them, says Heidegger, there vibrates the silent call of the earth, its quiet gift of ripening corn, and its enigmatic self-refusal in the fallow desolation of the wintry field. This equipment, he goes on, belongs to the earth, and it is protected in the world of the peasant woman. Van Gogh's painting is the disclosure of what the equipment, the pair of peasant shoes, is in truth. This entity emerges into the unconcealment of its being, by way of the mediation of the work of art, which draws the whole absent world and earth into revelation around itself, along with the heavy tread of the peasant woman, the loneliness of the field path, the hut in the clearing, the worn and broken instruments of labor in the furrows and at the hearth. Heidegger's account needs to be completed by insistence on the renewed materiality of the work, on the transformation of one form of materiality, the earth itself and its paths and physical objects, into that other materiality of oil paint, affirmed and foregrounded in its own right and for its own visual pleasures. But nonetheless, it has a satisfying plausibility. At any rate, both readings may be described as hermeneutical, in the sense in which the work, in its inert, objectal form, is taken as a clue or a symptom for some vaster reality, which replaces it as its ultimate truth. Now we need to look at some shoes of a different kind, and it is pleasant to be able to draw for such an image on the recent work of the central figure in contemporary visual art. Andy Warhol's diamond dust shoes evidently no longer speaks to us with any of the immediacy of Van Gogh's footwear. Indeed, I am tempted to say that it does not really speak to us at all. Nothing in this painting organizes even a minimal place for the viewer, who confronts it at the turning of a museum corridor or gallery, with all the contingency of some inexplicable natural object. On the level of the content, we have to do with what are now far more clearly fetishes, in both the Freudian and the Marxian senses. Derrida remarks somewhere about the Heideggerian Paarbauernschuhe, that the Van Gogh footgear are a heterosexual pair which allows neither for perversion nor for fetishization. Here, however, we have a random collection of dead objects hanging together on the canvas like so many turnips, as shorn of their earlier life world as the pile of shoes left over from Auschwitz, or the remainders and tokens of some incomprehensible and tragic fire in a packed dance hall. There is therefore in Warhol no way to complete the hermeneutic gesture and restore to these oddments that whole larger lived context of the dance hall or the ball, the world of jet-set fashion or glamour magazines. Yet this is even more paradoxical in the light of biographical information. Warhol began his artistic career as a commercial illustrator for shoe fashions and a designer of display windows, in which various pumps and slippers figured prominently. Indeed, one is tempted to raise here, far too prematurely, one of the central issues about postmodernism itself and its possible political dimensions. Andy Warhol's work, in fact, turns centrally around commodification, and the great billboard images of the Coca-Cola bottle or the Campbell's soup can, which explicitly foreground the commodity fetishism of a transition to late capital, ought to be powerful and critical political statements. If they are not that, then one would surely want to know why, and one would want to begin to wonder a little more seriously about the possibilities of political or critical art in the postmodern period of late capital. But there are some other significant differences between the high modernist and the postmodernist moment, between the shoes of Van Gogh and the shoes of Andy Warhol, on which we must now very briefly dwell. The first and most evident is the emergence of a new kind of flatness or depthlessness, a new kind of superficiality in the most literal sense, perhaps the supreme formal feature of all the postmodernisms, to which we will have occasion to return in a number of other contexts. Then we must surely come to terms with the role of photography and the photographic negative in contemporary art of this kind, and it is this indeed which confers its deathly quality to the Warhol image, whose glacéd X-ray elegance mortifies the reified eye of the viewer in a way that would seem to have nothing to do with death, or the death obsession, or the death anxiety on the level of content. It is indeed as though we had here to do with the inversion of Van Gogh's utopian gesture. In the earlier work, a stricken world, is by some Nietzschean fiat and act of the will transformed into the stridency of utopian colour. Here, on the contrary, it is as though the external uncoloured surface of things, debased and contaminated in advance by their assimilation to glossy advertising images, has been stripped away to reveal the deathly black and white substratum of the photographic negative which subtends them. Although this kind of death of the world of appearance becomes thematized in certain of Warhol's pieces, most notably the traffic accidents or the electric chair series, this is not, I think, a matter of content any longer, but of some more fundamental mutation, both in the object world itself, now become a set of texts or simulacra, and in the disposition of the subject. All of which brings me to a third feature to be developed here, what I will call the waning of affect in postmodern culture. Of course, it would be inaccurate to suggest that all affect, all feeling or emotion, all subjectivity has vanished from the newer image. Indeed, there is a kind of return of the repressed in Diamond Dust Shoes, a strange, compensatory, decorative exhilaration explicitly designated by the title itself, which is, of course, the glitter of gold dust, the spangling of gilt sand that seals the surface of the painting and yet continues to glint at us. Think, however, of Rimbaud's magical flowers that look back at you, or of the august premonitory eye flashes of Rilke's archaic Greek torso, which warned the bourgeois subject to change his life. Nothing of that sort here, in the gratuitous frivolity of this final decorative overlay. In an interesting review of the Italian version of this essay, Remo Ceserani expands this foot fetishism into a fourfold image which adds to the gaping modernist expressivity of the Van Gogh Heidegger shoes, the realist pathos of Walker Evans and James Agee. Strange that pathos should thus require a team. While what looked like a random assortment of yesteryear's fashions in Warhol takes on, in Magritte, the carnal reality of the human member itself, now more phantasmatic than the leather it is printed on. Magritte, unique among the surrealists, survived the sea change from the modern to its sequel, becoming in the process something of a postmodern emblem, the uncanny, Lacanian forclusion without expression. The ideal schizophrenic, indeed, is easy enough to please, provided only an eternal present is thrust before the eyes, which gaze with equal fascination on an old shoe or the tenaciously growing organic mystery of the human toenail. Ceserani thereby deserves a semiotic cube of his own. Please see the screen. The waning of affect is, however, perhaps best initially approached by way of the human figure, and it is obvious that what we have said about the commodification of objects holds as strongly for Warhol's human subjects, stars like Marilyn Monroe, who are themselves commodified and transformed into their own images. And here too a certain brutal return to the older period of high modernism offers a dramatic shorthand parable of the transformation in question. Edvard Munch's painting The Scream is, of course, a canonical expression of the great modernist thematics of alienation, anomie, solitude, social fragmentation, and isolation, a virtually programmatic emblem of what used to be called the Age of Anxiety. It will here be read as an embodiment not merely of the expression of that kind of affect, but even more as a virtual deconstruction of the very aesthetic of expression itself, which seems to have dominated much of what we call high modernism, but to have vanished away, for both practical and theoretical reasons, in the world of the postmodern. The very concept of expression presupposes indeed some separation within the subject, and along with that a whole metaphysics of the inside and outside, of the wordless pain within the monad, and the moment in which, often cathartically, that emotion is then projected out and externalized, as gesture or cry, as desperate communication and the outward dramatization of inward feeling. This is perhaps the moment to say something about contemporary theory, which has, among other things, been committed to the mission of criticizing and discrediting this very hermeneutic model of the inside and the outside, and of stigmatizing such models as ideological and metaphysical. But what is today called contemporary theory, or better still, theoretical discourse, is also, I want to argue, itself very precisely a postmodernist phenomenon. It would therefore be inconsistent to defend the truth of its theoretical insights in a situation in which the very concept of truth itself is part of the metaphysical baggage which post-structuralism seeks to abandon. What we can at least suggest is that the post-structuralist critique of the hermeneutic of what I will shortly call the depth model is useful for us as a very significant symptom of the very postmodernist culture, which is our subject here. Over hastily, we can say that besides the hermeneutic model of inside and outside, which Munch's painting develops, at least 4 other fundamental depth models have generally been repudiated in contemporary theory. 1. The dialectical one of essence and appearance, along with a whole range of concepts of ideology or false consciousness which tend to accompany it. 2. The Freudian model of latent and manifest, or of repression, which is, of course, the target of Michel Foucault's programmatic and symptomatic pamphlet La volonté de savoir, the history of sexuality. 3. The existential model of authenticity and inauthenticity, whose heroic or tragic thematics are closely related to that other great opposition between alienation and disalienation, itself equally a casualty of the post-structural or postmodern period. And 4, most recently, the great semiotic opposition between signifier and signified, which was itself rapidly unraveled and deconstructed during its brief heyday in the 1960s and 1970s. What replaces these various depth models is for the most part a conception of practices, discourses, and textual play whose new syntagmatic structures we will examine later on. Let it suffice now to observe that here too depth is replaced by surface, or by multiple surfaces. What is often called intertextuality is in that sense no longer a matter of depth. Nor is this depthlessness merely metaphorical. It can be experienced physically and literally by anyone who, mounting what used to be Raymond Chandler's Bunker Hill from the great Chicano markets on Broadway and 4th Street in downtown Los Angeles, suddenly confronts the great freestanding wall of the Wells Fargo Court, Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. A surface which seems to be unsupported by any volume, or whose putative volume, rectangular, trapezoidal, is ocularly quite undecidable. This great sheet of windows, with its gravity-defying two-dimensionality, momentarily transforms the solid ground on which we stand into the contents of a stereopticon, pasteboard shapes profiling themselves here and there around us. The visual effect is the same from all sides, as fateful as the great monolith in Stanley Kubrick's 2001, which confronts its viewers like an enigmatic destiny, a call to evolutionary mutation. If this new multinational downtown effectively abolished the older ruined city fabric, which is violently replaced, cannot something similar be said about the way in which this strange new surface, in its own peremptory way, renders our older systems of perception of the city somehow archaic and aimless, without offering another in their place? Returning now for one last moment to Munch's painting, it seems evident that the scream subtly but elaborately disconnects its own aesthetic of expression, all the while remaining imprisoned within it. Its gestural content already underscores its own failure, since the realm of the sonorous, the cry, the raw vibrations of the human throat are incompatible with its medium, something underscored within the work by the homunculus's lack of ears. Yet the absent scream returns, as it were, in a dialectic of loops and spirals, circling ever more closely toward that even more absent experience of atrocious solitude and anxiety which the scream was itself to express. Such loops inscribe themselves on the painted surface in the form of those great concentric circles in which sonorous vibration becomes ultimately visible, as on the surface of a sheet of water, in an infinite regress which fans out from the sufferer to become the very geography of a universe in which pain itself now speaks and vibrates through the material sunset and landscape. The visible world now becomes the wall of the monad on which this scream running through nature, Munch's words, is recorded and transcribed. One thinks of that character of Lautréamont who, growing up inside a sealed and silent membrane, ruptures it with his own scream on catching sight of the monstrousness of the deity, and thereby rejoins the world of sound and suffering. All of which suggests some more general historical hypothesis, namely, that concepts such as anxiety and alienation, and the experiences to which they correspond, as in the scream, are no longer appropriate in the world of the postmodern. The great Warhol figures, Marilyn herself, or Edie Sedgewick, the notorious cases of burnout and self-destruction of the ending 1960s, and the great dominant experiences of drugs and schizophrenia, would seem to have little enough in common anymore, either with the hysterics and neurotics of Freud's own day, or with those canonical experiences of radical isolation and solitude, anomie, private revolt, Van Gogh-type madness, which dominated the period of high modernism. This shift in the dynamics of cultural pathology can be characterized as one in which the alienation of the subject is displaced by the latter's fragmentation. Such terms inevitably recall one of the more fashionable themes in contemporary theory, that of the death of the subject itself, the end of the autonomous bourgeois monad or ego or individual, and the accompanying stress, whether as some new moral ideal or as empirical description, on the de-centering of that formerly centered subject or psyche. Of the two possible formulations of this notion, the historicist one, that a once existing centered subject in the period of classical capitalism and the nuclear family has today in the world of organizational bureaucracy dissolved, and the more radical post-structuralist position, for which such a subject never existed in the first place, but constituted something like an ideological mirage, I obviously incline toward the former. The latter must in any case take into account something like a reality of the appearance. We must, however, add that the problem of expression is itself closely linked to some conception of the subject as a monad-like container within which things felt are then expressed by projection outward. What we must now stress, however, is the degree to which the high modernist conception of a unique style, along with the accompanying collective ideals of an artistic or political vanguard or avant-garde, themselves stand or fall along with that older notion or experience of the so-called centered subject. Here, too, Munch's painting stands as a complex reflection on this complicated situation. It shows us that expression requires the category of the individual monad, but it also shows us the heavy price to be paid for that precondition, dramatizing the unhappy paradox that when you constitute your individual subjectivity as a self-sufficient field and a closed realm, you thereby shut yourself off from everything else and condemn yourself to the mindless solitude of the monad, buried alive and condemned to a prison cell without egress. Postmodernism presumably signals the end of this dilemma, which it replaces with a new one. The end of the bourgeois ego, or monad, no doubt brings with it the end of the psychopathologies of that ego, what I have been calling the waning of affect. But it means the end of much more, the end, for example, of style, in the sense of the unique and the personal, the end of the distinctive individual brushstroke, as symbolized by the emergent primacy of mechanical reproduction. As for expression and feelings or emotions, the liberation in contemporary society from the older anomie of the centered subject may also mean not merely a liberation from anxiety, but a liberation from every other kind of feeling as well, since there is no longer a self present to do the feeling. This is not to say that the cultural products of the postmodern era are utterly devoid of feeling, but rather that such feelings, which it may be better and more accurate, following J.F. Lyotard, to call intensities, are now free-floating and impersonal, and tend to be dominated by a peculiar kind of euphoria, a matter to which we will want to return later on. The waning of affect, however, might also have been characterized, in the narrower context of literary criticism, as the waning of the great high modernist thematics of time and temporality, the elegiac mysteries of durée and memory, something to be understood fully as much as a category of the literary criticism associated with high modernism as with the works themselves. We have often been told, however, that we now inhabit the synchronic rather than the diachronic, and I think it is at least empirically arguable that our daily life, our psychic experience, our cultural languages are today dominated by categories of space rather than by categories of time, as in the preceding period of high modernism.